is Stranger Than Fiction with Robert Homrich.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the strangest hour on the internet, Stranger Than Fiction. I'm your host, Robert Homrich, and today we're going to be digging even deeper into the mystery of ley lines and geomancy, because with me today is my good friend and fellow author, filmmaker, researcher, history buff, and I hear he plays a pretty mean guitar as well. He's authored 6 books on various topics ranging from the mysteries of Mount Shasta to the Oak Island mysteries. A lot of the stuff you're seeing on the latest season of the History Channel's Oak Island Mysteries, he was writing about 2 years ago, so he's definitely ahead of the game there. In fact, he says he's even found connections linking Oak Island to the Oak Island Mysteries to Washington, D.C., so I'm really looking forward to hearing what that's all about. And he's also the editor of the True History Journal, so without further ado, please allow me to welcome Cort Lindahl to the show. Cort, welcome to Stranger Than Fiction.
Well, thanks for having me, Rob. I appreciate it, and it's good to be here to chat with you about what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. So tell me a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Well, really, this kind of odyssey started for me about 10 years ago, when I had some time to look into things I was always curious about, and I began by looking at Thomas Jefferson, who I always thought was an interesting and enigmatic historical character.
Certainly.
And since I'd spent a lot of time in Virginia and attended school there, I was exposed to a lot of the history of Virginia. But when I started to look into him, what was most interesting was the kind of architecture that he produced. And, we know he played a role in the development of Washington, D.C., and he designed the Virginia State Capitol, Barboursville Mansion.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Let me ask you about that. He seems to have a sort of an obsession, if you will, with an octagon. Is that right?
Yes, and that really kind of feeds into what I found out as my studies went on. I looked at Monticello and Poplar Forest, which is an octagonal structure.
Sure.
And I learned that he was likely inspired to do this or to produce these kind of structures because he had been exposed to an octagonal building in colonial Williamsburg called the Powder Magazine. That all of these structures, as I studied on, kind of harkened back to the Tower of the Winds of Athens, which is an interesting structure that included a pressurized water clock, sundials, and served as an astronomical observatory. So what we're looking at in the Tower of the Winds of Athens is kind of a timekeeping laboratory that existed. The estimates range between 50 BC and 200 AD. And right around that time, we kind of see this art of timekeeping being applied to religious holidays of the time. Pagan holidays at that time was one of the things that motivated them. And more than likely, it was a priesthood of augurs that also were kind of the intellectuals of their day, somewhat like monks would be later, that kind of developed this art that may have disappeared for a while. But what I'm supposing is that the Greeks could even fix longitude using astronomy and this timekeeping apparatus that they had there. So this would have allowed them to kind of more accurately define their world. And all of this would be centered on like the Tower of the Winds being an axis mundi, or center of the world. And what this would lead to is really what is a map projection. And it's kind of like a polar map projection that a lot of the flat earth fans point to as representing the flat earth. But this kind of map is a point specific, where the Tower of the Winds would be the center of the map instead of the North Pole. So this allows you to draw straight lines from that axis, even on a representation of the globe that would be accurate without having to calculate arc as other maps are used in the modern world. So this is kind of a really crude and early way that I think leaders used to legally describe property. Mm-hmm. And it led to a lot of spiritual overtones associated with astrology and a lot of beliefs that go all the way back to Egypt and the earlier civilizations too. So I think Thomas Jefferson was hip to all of that. He was a very educated man who even studied land surveying at William and Mary when he attended there, and was also the surveyor of Albemarle County, where he was from, near where Charlottesville is today.
Yes, I was aware that he was a surveyor. I find it kind of interesting that he didn't do the survey work in Washington, D.C., considering he did have such a big hand in the development of that city.
Right. He did, as the story goes, lay out the White House meridian himself, so he did a small part of it.
Sure. Well,
And yeah, that's true. And really, he left surveying piers near what is today Meridian Hill Park. And I'm sure everyone's familiar with the White House meridian. It's the line of longitude that goes straight through the White House, and it marks Meridian Hill Park,
sure.
the Scottish Rite Temple in Washington, D.C., Lafayette Park, the Lighthouse, the center measurement point of Washington, D.C., and the Jefferson Pier Stone, because
Sure.
he placed himself two pier stones on the White House meridian to define that. So that was kind of his personal contribution to the streets of Washington, D.C. and the mysteries of Washington, D.C., because we do see a lot of the monuments on the White House meridian are presidential. That extends even to the old boundaries of Washington, D.C. So we have the White House, the Jefferson Memorial, Reagan Airport, the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, and even Fort Washington are all included on that meridian.
Sure, sure. And anyone who's
intentionally done, but not really spoken of.
right, and anyone who's familiar with my work, as a reference for what he's talking to, that's basically the axis line that all the chakras on V-Man line up with.
Right. That's central to your work as well.
Sure.
And everything is oriented along that axis as well. So that's kind of the tradition I'm talking about, because at each one of these structures, going back to the Tower of the Winds, and indeed anywhere where an astronomical observatory is established, they also establish a meridian or a line of longitude to compare themselves to other points on the Earth using astronomical observations from each place to compare their positions to each other. So it allows a kind of crude and rougher form of accurately defining the Earth for the first time.
So do you think...
really, that's kind of a powerful thing. Through history, it kind of came in and out of not being valued, but it was kind of a hidden thing at first. The first people to develop this, of course, couldn't teach it to everybody, didn't have the capacity to understand this.
Sure.
But also, it was kind of secret because it gave you advantages in navigation, trade, and mapping, and things like that kind of the upper class or ruling class would value a lot more. So as time went by, this being a Greek tradition, we see Emperor Constantine seemingly also being aware of this. He was from a Greek cultural background, as was the entire Byzantine era of history in the, quote, Roman Empire. So throughout the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire especially, we see all of the rulers living in an octagonal structure within the Daphne Palace in Istanbul, or what was then Constantinople. And Constantine built other octagons, and I believe he also built an octagonal structure on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock is today, and that even the Dome of the Rock may be built from pieces of the structure that he had built there originally.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting. I know a lot of people may or may not know a lot of what I do is how these octagonal structures actually behave, like the map projection I discussed before. It actually point to places on the Earth based on their octagonal form. So it's interesting that the northeastern facet of the Dome of the Rock points to the center of St. Peter's Square of the Vatican. And Constantine originally had a lot to do with the design of St. Peter's, the original old St. Peter's that was there, was oriented the same way it is today. And we see the keyhole design of the Vatican being later added by Bernini, and the Egyptian obelisk placed where it is today. So what's interesting about St. Peter's, in turn, we have the Dome of the Rock pointing there, but the whole easterly orientation of St. Peter's Square and Basilica itself points to the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, in the royal district there, that Constantine also designed. So two of these places are already have a tradition of Constantine having influenced the architecture there, or having built it, as history gives credit. So there's a lot of other people theorizing that he had an octagonal structure on the Temple Mount as well. And it's just amazing. When I checked that, indeed, it did point to St. Peter's Square.
And what would you care to speculate as to why we just had Scott Onstad on the show as well, and we were talking about this as well, and I'm just curious as to if you care to speculate as to why we're finding these monuments lining up in these ways.
Right. Well, I think it goes back to the same tradition that I'm pointing out, and really I'm starting with the Greeks because I just think they defined the cartography or the cartographic applications of this a little more in depth than the Egyptians did, or the Sumerians, or others that may have been adept at mathematics and astronomy as well. And really, from really just astrology, men gazing at the stars for millennia and noticing the regularities in it, led to them being able to spatially define the Earth. So that's a practical point of view. It gives you a way to legally describe property, which is kind of the provenance of rulers and kings, who would be more concerned with that in these earlier parts of history. But it also did lead to kind of applications of mystery schools using these things as kind of a hidden directional device or datum on the globe.
Sure.
And this even includes possibly the early Christians who were persecuted, who formed a mystery school with kind of secret symbols and stories that related Christian themes that seemed to conform to the pagan religion that was more accepted at the time. So in this way, a lot of these concepts later lead us to these treasure stories and a lot of these myths and legends that have to do with the temple treasure from the Temple Mount and things like that, where they're using these datums or points on the Earth that I'm pointing out as kind of a clue that may just lead to other clues or a treasure itself. So a lot of this is kind of initiatory too, and that this leads us to Washington, D.C. in a way, why the architecture there and the layout of the city is so enigmatic and inspires people to speculate as to what's going on, such as yourself.
Sure. So, gosh, I'm at a loss for words now after what you just, all that you just kind of laid on us. So I guess since we're touching upon the subject of mysteries, why don't you tell us what you've uncovered regarding the Oak Island mysteries?
All right. Well, yeah, my latest book is Oak Island and the Arcadian Mysteries, Oak Island, Rainless Chateau, and Shugborough Hall Revealed. It's kind of a long-winded name, but it kind of covers it all. And that as I started to look at some of these places, first I would find that there's a structure similar to the ones I've been describing that harkens back to the Tower of the Winds. And as I say, I started with Thomas Jefferson and sort of back-engineered all of this, back to the Tower of the Winds, but I noticed that a lot of these kind of mysteries that are presented to the public that are popular with some of your listeners and are kind of subjects of shows on the History Channel, such as Rennes Chateau or the Shugborough Hall and the Mystery of the Shepherd's Monument there, and Stirling Castle in Scotland. It's interesting, too. All of these places have an octagonal structure associated with them, and also In the descriptions of the mystery, the theme of Arcadia is mentioned. So the theme of Arcadia is very interesting in relation to the octagons because this refers to the pole star. And this is what ancient mariners or cartographers and surveyors would use to establish a true north to south line or line of longitude. So that is what all of these octagonal structures do. The name Arcadia refers to the mythical character Arcas, who through a long series of events was cast into the sky as Ursa Minor by Zeus in Greek mythology. And here's our Greek connection again as well. That the tale of Ursa Minor contains the pole star. So this is the kind of keyword or hint you're being given by it being referred to as an Arcadian mystery, that there's a landscape mystery associated that involves the pole star, or being able to know what that is in relation to measuring the Earth. So at Stirling Castle in Scotland, we have the King's Knot, which is a large octagonal earthworks there that's right next to the castle, that was built in honor of Charles I, who was one of the fallen kings of England, who was beheaded in part due to his Catholic beliefs and inability to work with the Parliament that was developing, or the representative government in England at that time. And this is about the mid-1600s at this time. So his last words, Charles I, were from a book named Arcadia, written by Sir Philip Sidney, who we'll get to again when we get to Oak Island, because the same book is connected to the Oak Island mystery, I believe. But it's significant that Charles I's last words were a prayer that was included in the book Arcadia, because then we come to Shugborough Hall, which includes an octagonal rendition of the Tower of the Winds. And this is an architectural folly that was built on the estate of Admiral Hanson, who was famous for being the third Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. So we see he has, knowledge of navigation and astronomy, just to be able to complete that and be the Lord High Admiral of England that he once was. But he created this monument, or his family did, on the Shugborough Hall grounds, known as the Shepherd's Monument. And the theme of the shepherd also relates to Arcadia, which Arcadia itself is defined as a utopian place that's agriculturally oriented and kind of supports the notion of the ruling class more. So on the Shepherd's Monument is a rendering of Nicolas Poussin's Et in Arcadia Ego, or the Shepherds of Arcadia. And the rendering is interesting because it's very similar to the rendering in the painting, but it includes a strange casket atop the tomb in the painting that is there, which I am supposing may be the head of Charles I, or some of his personal papers and belongings that are in this casket. People have used this monument to suppose that there's a treasure hidden at Shugborough Hall, and this kind of repeats the theme of lost treasures being associated with many of these places. So I believe that the Shepherd's Monument is simply a memento mori, or a remembrance monument for Charles I, because he retained a lot of supporters in England and Scotland and Ireland at that time, and this became a big political football for the next 50 or 60 years in England, because they eventually ended up replacing his family with German, Hanoverian, English monarchs of England today. So it just never sat well with a lot of people. So they again formed a mystery school and an underground intelligence service use of kind of all of this ancient mythology that has Greek references and in tandem with these structures. So on a very simple way, somebody could go to Shugborough Hall and tell that the answers may have been Jacobites or supporters of the fallen kings of England and Scotland and Ireland that were deposed. So that's another, thing I'm stressing again. There's always kind of a mystery school organization involved that is supporting a certain political or religious point of view that uses all of these symbols and metaphorical messages to kind of support their point of view and make people remember it, because these end up being facets of history that are presented to us as treasure stories. So when you really look into the treasure story, you find out about Charles I, who he was, when you're looking at the Shepherd's Monument. So this Arcadian theme is present at both Stirling Castle and Shugborough Hall, and really any fan of the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery knows that the Nicolas Poussin painting that inspired the Shepherd's Monument at Shugborough Hall is also involved in the Rennes-le-Chateau mystery. Mm-hmm. As part of some of the clues that famous author Henry Lincoln was supposed create a large pentagram in the landscape of Rennes-le-Chateau using monuments that are there as well. So really, it's amazing that the Arcadian theme is present at all of these places, but I had figured this out, and then of course I went back to the octagonal king's knot in Stirling Castle in Scotland and figured out the directions that it pointed to on the globe. And really, one of the southeasterly trending arcs suggested by that octagon crosses right over the Tower of the Winds at Shugborough Hall, and then it continues to Rennes-le-Chateau and bisects the star in the landscape of Rennes-le-Chateau perfectly. So actually the star is pointing back and suggesting the same arc on the globe. Mm-hmm. So as I started to look into all of that more, I even found the Stuart family, the exiled royal family of England, involved in all of these places, including Rennes-le-Chateau.
It's interesting.
The dots are getting more and more connected all the time on that to suggest that a lot of this was indeed arranged to teach us about these fallen monarchs who consequently also helped to create the United States, I believe, and are in part responsible for some of the things we see at Washington, D.C., Williamsburg, the Newport Tower, Oak Island, and other places like that. I've even found examples of it in California that predate some of the things that went on in Europe, because the gold rush was of such interest out here.
It's really interesting that how it all interconnects, which we often find when we stumble down rabbit holes. What other can you tell us any other mysteries that kind of are intertwined into this Oak Island mystery?
Sure. Well, I like to say too, it's not that every lost treasure or every octagonal structure is involved in what I'm saying. Those could very well be involved with another similar thing. But what I'm seeing is this same tradition of royalty. As I checked into the genealogy, even there's possible genealogical links all the way back to the Byzantine royalty I described before that lead to the more modern monarchs. So they're actually related to each other, possibly.
Sure.
So it's hard to prove the farther back you go into the Roman and Byzantine era, but there are some clear references to that, even with one of the Byzantine emperors being named Arcadius, and he married a woman that was Merovingian. Mm-hmm. And we know the Merovingian blood is the dynasty of French and European kings that many point to being related to Jesus Christ. Sure. And some of the theories about Mary Magdalene and things like that. So really this does lead us directly, I think, to the mystery of Oak Island, that could be one of these kind of metaphorical or allegorical mysteries meant to teach us some of these things. But in addition, there is a lot of indication there that something could have been hidden there, and that even these mythical stories, the mystery schools could have been found out by people's enemies, and factors of those could have been used against them by people promoting false leads or false mysteries that sounded similar. So that's when we get into the realm of intelligence services and the way these kind of things were used in the 1600s, 1700s, and even through the Civil War era and later. And so Oak Island could be something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I spoke of Philip Sidney before, and the book that he wrote called Arcadia, which is an interesting story about two knights that are shipwrecked in Arcadia, which is originally a part of Greece named for Arcus, the mythical character. That the beginning of the book describes one of the knights coming ashore with a treasure chest and meeting some Arcadian shepherds. So here we're already getting this imagery that's been suggested to us at these different places. And indeed, even Nova Scotia, or where Oak Island is located, is French Acadia, and Acadia is the French word for Arcadia. So we're being told in these kind of keywords that you get in all of these mysteries what's going on, to some regard, just by the names of the people that are involved and the keywords that are presented in the story. So as I've really looked into the history of Nova Scotia, I was interested to find that the first Baron of Nova Scotia was appointed such by King James I in the early 1600s. And William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling and the first Baron of Nova Scotia, actually amended Philip Sidney's book named Arcadia. And it was really just amazing for me to find. I started reading the book and word searching the book for certain terms, and I found a story in Philip Sidney's Arcadia that is exactly like the original story of Oak Island.
And how so?
Well, the original story involves, three young men. This is just the legendary mythical story, seeing lights on Oak Island one night and going to investigate, and they find a ship's tackle suspended from a tree, a pulley, with a depression under it. So they think, oh, this is where a pirate left the treasure. So they start excavating the pit and find a layer of flat stones just a little ways under the surface, but then as they excavate down, there's a layer of oaken logs every 10 feet. And eventually, the pit is excavated to 90 feet, where they find a stone with strange carvings on it that has never been seen or heard from again. But the story that I found in Arcadia matches exactly that, where one person is sent on a fool's errand to dig up a fake treasure that the other man had arranged so he could escape with the woman that the other man was guarding. So he tricked him into going to look for a treasure. But the description of the treasure being excavated in Arcadia matches the original story of Oak Island almost to a T, even with there being a graven stone at the bottom of the pit that the man finally is able to dig up, and there's only a piece of parchment beneath it that tells him he's been sent on a fool's errand. So I was stunned to read this book with all of the connections to Nova Scotia, including the first Baron of Nova Scotia, later editing this book about 60 years after it was originally written, and finding the same story in the book that all referred to Nova Scotia with the name Arcadia and the Arcadian theme being involved. So it was really amazing to find that. But
sounds like a handyman's signature to me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it certainly sounds like a handyman's signature, like maybe this came from the same mind, if you will.
Right, well, there's several different possibilities. Either somebody had arranged a treasure to look just like what was in the book, or somebody arranged something that looked like what was in the book to fool somebody else into thinking there was a treasure there, because that's what part of the story in the book is, that it was all arranged as a fake thing just to divert this man from guarding the woman of his desire so the other man could leave with his girlfriend.
Sure. And so
So
does that
go
make
ahead.
you take a different approach with the Oak Island mystery then? Does that kind of make you think maybe that's the same case with that?
Yes, I think that could go either way because it's really interesting, and Philip Sidney's really an interesting man in and of himself. He's the uncle of William and Philip Herbert, who are the sons of his sister, Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke. And Mary Sidney actually wrote a book about Enochian geomancy
Mm-hmm.
in the 17th century. So, bam, there we go. I can see right away the possible use of geographic clues, landscape mysteries, and the kind of mystery school application of folklore that I've seen at involved in these other mysteries. And his two nephews are the subject of the dedication of the first folio of Shakespeare. It's dedicated to William and Philip Herbert, and of course Philip Herbert is named after Philip Sidney. And here that's an interesting story too, because later, when Charles I was beheaded, the king that I referred to as being involved with the Arcadian Mysteries, who even quoted Philip Sidney's book right before he was beheaded, Philip Sidney's nephew, Philip Herbert, ended up owning the copy of the first folio, which was dedicated to him and his brother, that Charles I had been reading and owned just before his execution. So this is really interesting, and this is leading us into all the overtones of Shakespeare and Sir Francis Bacon, who seems to be involved in a lot of these kind of landscape mysteries, or maybe not directly involved, but the inspiration for later people designing things that kind of adhered to and used the imagery of Shakespeare and the work of Sir Francis Bacon, even extending to the New Atlantis, which I think a couple of these towers in colonial America were referring to the New Atlantis, such as the Newport Tower and the Powder Magazine in colonial Williamsburg, for the first time, because traditionally these places with the octagonal structures, due to their associations with the Dome of the Rock that I described before, were kind of known of as New Jerusalem. So all of these places around the world, some of these places, especially like Santiago de Compostela, the remains of St. James are, became New Jerusalems at the time when pilgrims could not actually go to the Holy Land because the Muslims controlled it. So they would kind of almost make up a New Jerusalem for people to go on pilgrimage to and worship and have kind of the experience of a pilgrim without going to Jerusalem.
Right. Interesting. Very, very interesting. It seems like it's all one big club, and they're all using the same playbook, if you will.
Right. And this is kind of too the involvement of William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling and Baron of Nova Scotia, is also terribly interesting, because really I couldn't believe this when I found it out, because I found out that his exact family, his descendants, were later American. And they are the namesakes of Alexandria, Virginia, and they owned most of the land that would become the original area or city of Washington, D.C., south of the Potomac. You and I know, as do others, that the original boundaries of Washington, D.C. were a 10-mile square diamond, a square rotated 45 degrees to make a diamond shape.
Sure. And then
so they owned much of that property. And even prior to the Revolutionary War, there was another later William Alexander that was a direct member of the same Washington, D.C. family that actually returned to Scotland and demanded he be awarded the title of the Earl of Stirling and Baron of Nova Scotia. So the Scottish peerage approved this, but British Parliament would not approve this. And we'll see why, obviously, because this William Alexander later became a general in the Continental Army and fought against the British. And if he would have been awarded his title back, then Nova Scotia would have likely ended up being part of the United States. Mm-hmm. So here we have the exact same family of the Baron of Nova Scotia that I described, that edited and amended Philip Sidney's Arcadia, which is involved with Charles I and the namesake of French Nova Scotia, or French Acadia, actually being a Revolutionary War hero and his family being involved in the development of Washington, D.C. So there's some incredible links to this whole kind of theory I have of the landscape mysteries and these treasure stories, you know, relating to really Washington, D.C., which is the biggest icon of landscape mysteries that we have.
Sure.
And so a lot of this actually does relate to that. And, you know, through my studies, I found, you know, that the two other structures, the Newport Tower and the octagonal powder magazine in Colonial Williamsburg, were all related to this intermarried web of early American families that kind of maintained their presence in commerce and spiritual matters throughout the early history of the United States, even up until now, in some ways. So it's kind of interesting to note all of that, too, but to see the Arcadian connection even coming to Virginia, where I'm more or less from, was really kind of interesting, even to the point where I found that the famous 1529 map of Verrazano, the Venetian explorer who worked for the French king, named the coastal region of Maryland and Virginia Arcadia on his map.
Interesting.
So this kind of became obvious that it was valued later in these kind of mysteries that were developed, like the mystery or legend of a stash of Sir Francis Bacon's papers being brought to Jamestown and Williamsburg, and eventually being hidden in the churchyard of the Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg. So this loops me all the way back now to Thomas Jefferson, who I began with by examining his octagonal structures, you know, only to find he has family relations to the Alexander family, the Mason family, the Lewis family, and that even two descendants of the same family of Sir Francis Bacon worked for President Jefferson and helped him manage his Monticello estate.
So really,
yeah, they actually worked for him.
Right. So really, what I'm gathering here is like you're researching and writing about all these different topics, and they might seem like to the layperson they might seem like they're completely unrelated, but it seems to me like what you're telling me is that all your work is these different books you've written are really all intertwined and interconnected and related with one another.
They are, and I've been kind of saying that since the beginning. I sensed it and could see it, but couldn't explain it as well as I can now. And, you know, again, I'd like to stress, I'm not saying every treasure legend in the world or every lost treasure or structure has these qualities. I think I was fortunate enough just to find a certain string of evidence that one family group and one certain group of people valued this in the way they value it. So there's different interpretations of it as well. You know, as you may have, or Scott, or anybody else, Freeman, your other guests, you know, have different points of views due to how they approached it and the way they see it. I just happen to see this one pathway that presented me with clues I kept being familiar with, as in the Arcadian theme and the mythology surrounding that, the octagonal structures that were all a reference to Greek culture.
Mm-hmm. So what else are there any other connections that you can go into about that connect with DC specifically?
Well, sure. Obviously, it's really interesting. Here's another, connection I found that links Williamsburg, the Newport Tower, and Nova Scotia together is the development of Williamsburg itself. Because I think Williamsburg was intended to be the first New Atlantis or New Jerusalem in North America. And the design of it is a linear design, really that later the National Mall kind of owes some of its design characteristics to, because Williamsburg was the colonial capital as well. So on the western end, we have the College of William and Mary, and Wren Hall, which is named for Masonic architect Christopher Wren, who inspired the design of that structure. And that's one of the oldest college buildings in America on any college campus. But extending just 90 degrees to the east of there is the Duke of Gloucester Street. And along that, we had the Bruton Parish Church, the Octagonal Powders magazine, and then on the eastern end, the Colonial House of Burgesses or Capitol built, just like the National Mall. You know, this kind of predates that. And I think they were referencing that, too. But what is interesting about this is that one of the early colonial governors of Virginia was named Francis Nicholson. And he is the one who is credited with designing the street plan of Williamsburg, and also of Annapolis, Maryland, that also other architects compared to Washington, D.C., because it has the diagonal streets crossing the more evenly grade streets, just like in Washington, D.C.
Sure.
But what's interesting about Nicholson, he was the governor of Virginia, and he was the governor of Maryland and New York, but then finally he was also the governor of Nova Scotia. So here's this man, who is a landscape architect who's designing the plans of towns and cities that even has an impact, on the history of Nova Scotia, and has connections to all of these Virginia families like the Alexanders that I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
So he's an interesting character too, and I'm looking into him a lot more, and I think he may have something to do with it as well. I mean, some landscape architects even, as I said, credit him with inspiring the National Mall. So he's an important fellow, and he had an impact on all of these places, even to Newport, Rhode Island, where the Newport Tower is, because he is credited with founding the Episcopal Church there,
yes,
which I believe is part of the mystery of the Newport Tower as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting story as well. Could you go into a little more detail about the Newport Tower and
Sure.
its origins?
The Newport Tower is kind of this strange stone tower that's in Newport that's been there for a long time.
And of
but
course,
there's early accounts of it. Go ahead.
Of course, it's astrologically aligned and all that, just like we find in all of these things.
Right. There's lots of theories about that. What I found was that it has 8 archways, and it seems that the structure was intended to be oriented to true north, so it could be used in the fashion I described before as the center of a map projection.
Sure.
So we have just even the will. I kind of go against the grain of the conspiracy theory on this one. So the will of Governor Benedict Arnold names it as it being his, quote, stone-built windmill. And this statement was made in tandem in his will with him asking to be buried in alignment with his mansion and the Newport Tower.
Right.
He wanted to be buried in alignment along the pathway between his home and the Newport Tower. I thought that was interesting.
That is interesting. It's a telltale sign that there's more going on with these alignments than meets the eye.
Right. So he's telling you a clue right there that whatever's going on there may involve measurements, in reference to the tower.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he did build the tower. And if, sometimes all of the people that are very anxious to associate that tower with the Knights Templar or Vikings and things like that kind of ignore local history or putting things in a historical context that may, provide you with information that will dispute those kind of theories. And I found just that really in the form of famous poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote poems that refer to the Newport Tower, and he wrote short essays of text explaining that he thought it was Norse, and why he did. He wrote other poems, A Skeleton in Armor, but he's a really interesting character because I found him to be kind of a literary spy or an artist that was engaged in kind of promoting this romantic nationalist view of the United States by promoting it in literature. And he worked with other artists like Edgar Allan Poe, James Fenimore Cooper, Samuel Morse, that were all likely members of the Society of the Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
And the Society of the Cincinnati is a group of Revolutionary War veterans who were officers and one of their lineal male descendants. And this includes the Marquis de Lafayette, Commander Rochambeau, Pierre L'Enfant, and Frenchmen and men of other nationalities.
I was just going to say that's another connection because I know that he actually L'Enfant designed the seal of the Society of Cincinnati.
Exactly, and we all know that he was heavily involved in designing the street plan of Washington D.C. and made those kind of contributions. And
so
he also designed the altarpiece at St. Paul's Chapel in New York City. That's famous for having survived 9/11, which is an early American church, and that's another aspect of this. Every place that there's a place of mystery, there's an early Episcopal church that was very active in colonial society, and all of the revolutionaries and loyalists would attend these churches. So they did have a role to play in this era, of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And even Francis Nicholson established the Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg and the Trinity Church in Newport, Rhode Island. Mm-hmm. So it's really amazing, too, that the octagonal form of the Powder magazine points the line or arc on the globe to the Newport Tower.
Yeah, at some point, it's like I keep saying it over and over and over. At some point, you got to ask yourself, when do coincidences stop being coincidences?
Exactly, and of course, I always, sometimes you do find chance alignments to things that don't make any sense. But when I keep seeing the same people involved in developing even the mysterious parts
right.
that are parts of the legends of both places, it's time to stop and think that yes, this kind of thing was done intentional.
Sure.
It's too many times I found the alignments where I just couldn't even believe it. After I would find all of the information that said that these places were related just through the people involved, I would find them actually pointing towards each other using these octagonal structures specifically.
Sure.
So yeah, it still blows my mind even at this point after I've been doing it for so long.
And of course, it's probably not too much of a stretch to assume or consider the possibility that these were all Freemasons we're talking about.
Right. I mean, I think most of what I've narrowed it down to what I think are some of the intentional ones. Occasionally I'll find one that's just a chance alignment, but really there's so much proof that leads to something you can't empirically prove as usual. That speaks to kind of the mystic school way all of these things are set up, where the story is told to you all in circumstantial, metaphorical and allegorical ways that lead you to a certain way of believing things.
Mm-hmm.
So the Newport Tower, Oak Island, Williamsburg, and even the streets of Washington, D.C., I think are part of that.
Oh, certainly, and we find stuff like this all over the world too. It's like some of the things that I find in Washington D.C. you're going to find in numerous cities all over the world too. It's just they're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere.
Sure, that speaks to some of the parts I haven't had the time really to look into. There's an extensive tradition of similar timekeeping architecture in India and China, really, that might be the inspiration for all of this in the Western world. If you look at the way trade happened and things like that in the ancient world, it could have easily originated there or been brought there later as well. But it's amazing that there's so many similarities, cross-culturally in structures like this, even in Central America. In North America, we have the mound builders and things like that,
sure,
where they were doing astronomy. It's obvious that they were, as all men did, were developing this art that in turn opened up the doors to science and technology to you. So it's interesting that it developed in different places at different time. And in the ancient world, you can kind of see certain cultures developing it, like Egypt or Sumeria, and then it being lost, through historical mechanizations, kind of like the burning of the library at Alexandria,
Sure.
or certain, empires being conquered and taking that information underground the way I've been describing. So that's kind of part of the way it gained all these mythical and mysterious overtones over time. So I think, even, as our country began to develop before the revolution, there were men who recognized this. A lot of the exiles that supported the fallen kings that I discussed before were exiled in Virginia and even Newport, Rhode Island, and were known as the Cavaliers. And that's even where the sports teams of the University of Virginia come from, that name. But there were loyalists in the colonies to the new kings, but they also had this underground movement that supported James II and later Bonnie Prince Charlie. And each time they staged a revolution to try to take Scotland or England back over, a lot of the men who took part in that would come to either Scandinavia or the colonies. So they contributed a lot to the political landscape, maybe where they were even using a mystery school or intelligence service to get what they wanted done. So by the time the revolution came, it's really interesting because we have kind of this hidden faction of Catholic people, because the fallen kings were Catholic, that supported the creation of the United States in tandem with kind of this enlightened set of Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and James Madison that we see, and John Adams to some extent, that didn't have these religious overtones or concerns in what they wanted to do. But lo and behold, we ended up with freedom religion in the United States that allowed Catholicism and other forms of faith to be worshipped freely as part of the deal. And that wasn't always clear. There were some factions that didn't even want to allow Catholics because England didn't allow them at that time. Mm-hmm. So a lot of those people were also forced to kind of take part in secret ways of worshiping or expressing their faith in early America. And this just didn't include Catholics. The Jacobites, that's who these people are termed, also included all of the satellite people that had benefited from these kings being in charge. The people who owned the businesses that supplied the military, fixed the ships in the Navy or built ships for the Navy, all lost their economic advantage because the king that they supported lost power. So all of these people came to support the United States as well, or the creation of the United States. So really, that's what leads us to Washington, D.C., and really as the country moved westward, other cities like Indianapolis and Denver, and even Chico, my hometown, having aspects in their architecture and layout that harken back to Washington, D.C. and these kinds of mysteries, because in part it is patriotic.
Yeah, if you could, why don't you go into what you found in Chico a little bit?
Sure. Well, that was one thing I found later, after I had, already found the cherry-picked, all of the bigger ones like Washington, D.C. and Rennes-le-Chateau and the King's Knot. I started to look at the really unique city plaza that we have here in Chico. And as I read up about that, I found that the founder of the town, John Bidwell, when he dedicated the city plaza, had plowed a circle in the earth just like Constantine did to establish the royal district of Constantinople when he had done that. So I'm saying, okay, here's a geometric design on the earth the city plaza even has a mosaic of the earth in the middle of it with the swirly designs kind of, leading to it in a spiral type pattern. It's showing you that it's an axis mundi just from the design of it. Mm-hmm. So I began to look into the, early history of Chico and into John Bidwell's genealogy, and I found out he was linked to a group of first founders of Hartford, Connecticut, that kind of later in history, just 200 years later, played a large role in the development of California. And all these families were interrelated. And again, I saw the Alexander family, the Mason family, and a lot of these, the Beale family, famous from the Beale treasure name, helping to develop California. And even I noticed that the design of the town was a diamond shape. The original 8x8 block plan of the city reminded me of the original city limits of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it was just.
And I noticed this for years and years, and it bothered me because I couldn't find a real link beyond the fact that Bidwell had been a United States Senator and lived in Washington, D.C. for 4 years. But what led me to the big break in really making the connection was through his wife, who's known as Annie Bidwell. So Annie Bidwell's original name was Annie Ellicott Kennedy.
Ellicott, huh?
Right.
Gotcha.
And her Ellicott name comes from their relation to Andrew Ellicott.
Right,
I'm sure you know.
Who did the surveying for
the design of Washington,
yes.
D.C. after Pierre L'Enfant withdrew.
Sure.
And, drew the plan from memory, all the famous stories about how he actually laid out the boundaries and placed the boundary stones. He was the actual surveyor who laid out the street plan, even based on the plan of L'Enfant. So this kind of ended the mystery of why Washington, D.C., or Chico, resembles what I term a miniature Washington, D.C. in its original plan. So it was even amazing for me to find that Annie Bidwell's sister married a member of the Alexander family, of the very same family I described being related to William Alexander, the first Baron of Nova Scotia. So there we get the Arcadian Mysteries all the way from Oak Island, California, via the same family being in a position to have knowledge of these kind of things throughout the whole scheme of history. And even, influencing the kind of artistic and plan of the landscape of places they live. And it's interesting because later people here added to it. The city plaza actually points to Bidwell Mansion, the mansion that John Bidwell built. So he aligned his mansion with the street plan and the axis of the city plaza. And if this arc on the globe is extended to 18 miles outside of Chico, it leads to the property of the monastery of New Clairvaux, which is a Cistercian monastery that everybody may be familiar with the fact that the Cistercian order created the famous Knights Templar. And the famous Hearst family, that's known for owning a lot of newspapers and publishing concerns, actually in the 1930s, William Randolph Hearst had moved a chapter house from a Cistercian monastery in Spain. It was taken apart, put on a ship, and brought and sat in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco until the early 2000s, when it was donated to the monastery of New Clairvaux, and this actual medieval church chapter house is being rebuilt right here near Chico that aligns with the city plaza as well. That's really interesting. And, you can even go there and see 11th century masons' marks on the stones, and they have a winery there, so you can go for a wine tasting, and you can speak to the monks. I think they can talk to you when you're there visiting, so it's kind of interesting to go there and check it out and speculate as to whether it was intentionally arranged this way. And really, what I found out that it may have been, because the site of the monastery is the site of a place called Benton City. That was a city planned by a Danish-American early pioneer of California, and that was his ranch there, and he was close friends with John Bidwell. So the alignment may have originally been meant to designate where Benton City is with his friend. And, coincidentally, the very first Masonic charter to come to California was brought to Peter Lassen's ranch, or Benton City, where the first Masonic lodge was established there in California. So we're kind of seeing maybe some of the ceremonial or talismanic overtones that I referred to before. But I mean, even some of the later architecture in the 1930s of downtown Chico seems to refer or pay homage to the city plaza and the original plan. There's even a Bank of America building that aligns with the city plaza that has all this classical imagery. It has Ishtar, Prometheus, Hermes, and Tubal-Cain represented in these bas-relief carvings around the doorway that kind of vaguely resembles an Ishtar's gate. Mm-hmm. So these concepts have kind of been known of in the past. I mean, we even have a Carnegie Library here in Chico that once had an octagonal tower that unfortunately was torn down, because I think that was the octagon of the architecture of Chico, and it was kind of probably taken down in an era when nobody thought about, the kind of overtones that I'm suggesting, and it was just demolished. So that was unfortunate too. But
so do you think this is like a lost art, or do you think this is something that these societies, if you will, they're still aware of and they're still implementing in cities in city plans and stuff like that today, or do you think this is like a lost art?
I think it's gained more popularity maybe in the latter part of the 20th century, like from the 1950s on. It seemed like, into the 20s and 30s, World War II kind of put a damper on it. Modern architects are definitely aware of these kinds of things, and they think, in this kind of tradition that, to me it makes a lot of sense. If you're going to go to a lot of trouble to build a monument or a piece of architecture that you're putting a lot of effort into it, you might as well put some mystery in there with it, or things that might show, mathematical concepts or, metrological concepts like Scott talks about, and things like that, and obviously symbolical things. Really, one of the best examples I found of that is the IMK pyramid and inverted pyramid that serve as the entrance to the Louvre Museum in Paris. Really, which, these are modern, forms of ancient architecture that are interesting, but I found if you draw an arc on the globe at the direction of the alignment of the two pyramids, to the east, it points to Migdal, Israel, which is the birthplace of Mary Magdalene, and to the west, it points to Oak Island, Nova Scotia. Mm-hmm. So that, to me, was really interesting in tandem with the movie The Da Vinci Code, that has the hero of the movie realizing the crypt of Mary Magdalene is beneath the inverted pyramid at the end of the movie, and this whole array of architecture actually points to her birthplace.
Mm-hmm. Connecting some more dots there. So I guess to wrap this all up, with regards to your work, I guess what message do you think it's most important for people to take home from your work?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, I've tried to, as I've written, to keep my, political beliefs out of it, and I've tried to stick more to just what I can find from historical sources and not go too far afield, speculating beyond what I can actually find proof of. But really what I wish they would walk away with is that there's always more to the story. And if you're being presented a story that in some ways, sounds like a fairy tale or a comic book, like the original story of Oak Island or the mystery of the Bruton Parish church vault, or even the story of Rennes-le-Chateau, that there's always more to it. If this may be designed kind of like the movie National Treasure, not necessarily to lead you to one specific treasure, but what you may learn along the way about history that you would never find just by looking in the history book alone, because it forces you to dig into the personalities involved in these kind of esoteric concepts that they value to communicate with each other. And I know a lot of people have negative, views of the quote occult, and Satanism and things like that, and some people that do believe those type of things use these very concepts to hide what they're doing, just like the Christians of Rome did. So it's an effective way of kind of having a veiled notion of telling the truth. You know, a lot of people speak about that comment on the quote cult, that they tell the truth about whatever they're doing, so that the truth is there, and it's not always the most obvious thing you might suspect, so you have to really kind of try harder to get to it.
Right, or the term I like to use a lot is for those with the eyes to see, because it really is, you really have to kind of acquire a taste for it, if you will. It's, you know, you got...
Yes, and it takes a lot of background knowledge that builds up slowly before you can really kind of correctly start to look at it. But don't give up, you know, keep reading and studying what things mean, and you'll go down strong directions.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of this is conspiracy, so there's things that were put there to lead you the wrong way sometimes, so you just stay objective and keep at it. You'll start to see what's going on more clearly.
Well, that's a great answer to a tough question, so I gotta hand it to you there. So his book is called Oak Island and the Arcadian Mysteries. That's his latest book, anyway. You want to tell people where they can find that?
Sure, there's links to all that at my blog, survivalcell.blogspot.com, or you can get my books on Amazon or createspace.com, and everyone's welcome to check me out on Facebook as well.
Of course, and I'll leave links in the description box to all that stuff, as usual.
Awesome.
Anything else you want to cover real quick while we wrap things up?
No, I just wanted to thank you a lot for having me on. It's been great talking to you. It's been like therapy, man.
Well, awesome. I appreciate it too. I love it, and I look forward to hearing. What else are you got? What can we look forward to seeing from you in the future?
Well, I'm taking a break right now, but recently I have been compiling more information. I'm always researching. I decided not to write something else for a while because I find out I put my books out too soon and then find out a lot more later.
Yeah, well,
don't try to show some patience and restraint.
Don't let that stop you, because you'll never get your work done. I know that from personal experience.
Right, that's true. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer this time. Usually I've been cranking one out every year, so I'm going to wait a little bit this time.
Right, and that's another thing I should probably know, that you actually you make yourself available to research. If somebody else has something they want researched, you're the guy to call, right?
Sure, certainly. If you want me to look into like a lost treasure story or some interesting genealogy or the history of the town where you live, I'd be happy to do that, so contact.
So, connecting the dots, that's what we do here, and so I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for being here, and hopefully we'll get together again real soon and do this again, and you can catch us up on all your newest discoveries and revelations. And
right on.
So,
anytime, Rob. I appreciate you having me on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. We'll see everybody next week on Stranger Than Fiction. We'll continue exploring these mysteries. Until then, I'll see you. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.